5 years since Russia invaded Ukraine, and Ukraine relies on military aid to try to keep Russia from taking more territory. With us now is Nolan Peterson. He works as a correspondent in Ukraine after serving as a pilot in the U.S. Air Force, where he did tours in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Nolan, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for your service.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
Really appreciate you.
Thanks.
So before we talk about this book here, do want to ask you, I know this week there's been a lot, obviously, with the impeachment hearings, and then what it's been like. Want to know from you, just watching the coverage of Ukraine, since you're so familiar with that country.
Right. Well, I think when I first arrived in Ukraine in 2014, I think one of the most striking impressions I had of the war was that it seemed so forgotten and overlooked by the rest of the world. And when I arrived, I saw tank battles and artillery barrages in a European country in our time. And all these years later, and through all my years of reporting on the war, I still have retained that feeling like it's been a forgotten war. And now, finally, people are paying attention to what's going on in Ukraine. Perhaps not in the way that I had hoped after 5 years of reporting on the conflict, but now people are aware of what's going on, and they are aware that Russia invaded a sovereign country and that the Ukrainian people are essentially fighting for their freedom.
Yeah, obviously the U.S. now is just focused on how Ukraine factors into the impeachment inquiry, the big news of the week, of course. What do you think Americans should know about this former Soviet satellite nation?
Well, for me, I feel privileged that since 2014, I had the ability to watch the birth of a democracy. And when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, Ukraine's military was in shambles. It was depleted by decades of corruption, and it was the Ukrainian people who stood up and launched a grassroots war effort to turn back the Russian invasion. These are people who, through no prodding of propaganda, decided to stand up and fight for their freedom and defend their homeland. And 5 years later, they're still fighting. So in a lot of ways, Ukraine is a democratic success story. And as an American, particularly as a veteran who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was really inspiring for me to see a nation of people who are essentially fighting for the American dream. And it really inspired me. And I think that's a story that many Americans would also be inspired and sort of heartened by, to know that our country retains the ability to prod people and to inspire them to fight for their freedom. And that's, I think, the big takeaway that most Americans should get from the war.
And speaking of that inspiration, you have a new book out, if you can hold it up for us. It's called Why Soldiers Miss War. And in it, you've actually talked about being drawn to the front lines in Ukraine. Just talk a little bit about this book.
Yeah, so when I left the military, my career in the military after being a special operations pilot, I think I experienced something that's very common among many veterans, particularly combat veterans. And that's I felt like I had lost a sense of purpose in my life. And so when I left the military, I think I tried to rediscover that sense of purpose in life by becoming a combat journalist. And I've reported on the war in Ukraine, but also I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan. I've even tracked down Tibetan freedom fighters in the Himalayas. And throughout all that time, it was sort of a downward spiral for me in a way. I kept taking greater and greater risks, trying to recreate what I thought I had lost when I left the military. And ultimately, it was when I met my wife and I fell in love with her that I was finally able to rediscover that sense of purpose that I thought I had lost. And ultimately, it was her love who saved me in my life. And I think that's a great message for many veterans, but also for anybody. I think one thing that veterans deal with nowadays that perhaps wasn't present in other wars is that modern society can be a bit lonely at times. And we're all so engrossed in social media and the internet. And so I think there's a message there for everybody that, to find true purpose in your life, it comes down to love.
What a great message, and certainly something that readers will take away when they read your book. Nolan, thank you so much for joining us this morning on the show.
Thank you for having me on.
Good luck.
Thanks.
All righty.